sometimes a piece of folded paper can change everything. The studio lights were hot that night. November 1985. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was in full swing. The band played its familiar rhythm. The audience laughed on cue. Johnny sat behind his desk, tie perfectly knotted, hair immaculately combed, delivering his monologue with that signature timing everyone knew by heart. And then Lucille Ball walked out. The applause was deafening. America's queen of comedy. The woman who had built television with her bare hands. She waved, smiled that brilliant smile, and took her seat in the guest chair. Johnny leaned back, ready to do what he always did, make her laugh, tell stories, keep the energy light. But something was different. Her hands were shaking. Johnny noticed it immediately. The way her fingers gripped the armrest. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He'd known Lucy for decades. They'd worked together, laughed together, survived the ruthless machinery of Hollywood together. And he knew when something was wrong. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The interview began like any other. Johnny asked about her new project. Lucy answered with her usual charm. The audience laughed. Everything seemed normal. But then, mid-sentence, she stopped. Her voice caught. She looked down at her lap. And she pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Johnny," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." The studio went silent. Johnny's smile faded. He leaned forward. "Lucy?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached across the desk and placed the folded note in his hand. Her fingers lingered for just a moment. Then she pulled back, her eyes glistening under the studio lights. Johnny looked down at the note. Then at Lucy. Then at the audience. For the first time in 30 years of live television, Johnny Carson didn't know what to do. He unfolded the paper. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. What happened next wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. It was real. Johnny read the note silently. His face changed. The color drained from his cheeks. His jaw tightened. He set the note down on the desk, carefully, like it was made of glass. Then he did something no one had ever seen him do before. He stood up. The band stopped playing. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet. Ed McMahon sat perfectly still, his usual grin gone. The audience held its breath. Even the cameraman didn't move. Johnny walked around the desk. He crossed the small space between them. And he sat down in the chair next to Lucy. Not across from her. Next to her. He took her hand. "Lucy," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this." She shook her head. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she wasn't hiding them. "Yes, I do," she said. "I need people to know." Johnny nodded. He squeezed her hand. Then he turned to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "what you're about to hear is not part of the show. This is real. And it matters." He looked back at Lucy. She took a deep breath. And she told the story. It wasn't a story about fame. It wasn't about Hollywood. It was about loss. About grief. About the kind of pain that doesn't go away just because you're famous. Lucy's husband, Gary Morton, had been diagnosed with lung cancer 6 months earlier. The doctors had given him a year. Maybe less. She'd been carrying this secret alone, smiling on camera, performing for the world, while her heart was breaking in private. The note Johnny had read was simple. Just a few words. "I can't pretend anymore. Help me." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny didn't ask her questions. He didn't try to steer the conversation back to something lighter. He just sat there, holding her hand, letting her speak. And when she couldn't speak anymore, he spoke for her. "You know," Johnny said, his voice soft, "we spend so much time in this business pretending. Pretending we're okay. Pretending we're strong. pretending that everything is fine. But the truth is, we're just people. And people hurt. He looked out at the audience. They were silent. Some were crying. Lucy is one of the strongest people I've ever known, Johnny continued. But strength doesn't mean you don't feel pain. It means you keep going even when you do. And tonight she's showing us what real strength looks like. The applause started slowly. One person. Then another. Then the entire studio rose to their feet. It wasn't the kind of applause you give after a punchline. It was something deeper. It was gratitude. Recognition. Love. Lucy stood. Johnny stood with her. They embraced. The cameras caught it all. The note still sat on Johnny's desk, a small piece of paper that had changed everything. When the show ended that night, Johnny didn't go to his dressing room. He didn't shake hands with guests or sign autographs. He walked backstage, found a quiet corner, and sat down alone. Ed McMahon found him there 20 minutes later. "You okay, boss?" Ed asked. Johnny looked up. His eyes were red. "No," he said. "But she will be. That's what matters." Ed nodded. He'd worked with Johnny long enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. This was a time for silence. But before Ed could leave, Johnny spoke again. "You know what the hardest part of this job is?" Johnny asked. Ed shook his head. "It's remembering that the people watching aren't just an audience. They're human beings. They're going through things we'll never know about. And sometimes, the best thing we can do is just be real with them." Ed sat down next to him. "You were real tonight, Johnny. More real than I've ever seen you." Johnny picked up the note. He'd kept it. He looked at it for a long time. "She trusted me with this," he said quietly. "That's not something I take lightly." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. The next day, the phones at NBC didn't stop ringing. Thousands of calls. Letters poured in by the hundreds. People from all over the country writing to thank Lucy. To thank Johnny. To share their own stories of loss and grief and pain. One letter stood out. It was from a woman in Ohio. She'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years earlier. She'd been watching The Tonight Show that night with her teenage daughter. And when Lucy broke down, when Johnny stood up and sat beside her, the woman and her daughter had done something they hadn't done in years. They talked. Really talked. About the husband. The father. The man they both missed. The grief they'd been carrying alone. "You gave us permission to be sad," the letter read. "And that's a gift I can never repay." Johnny kept that letter. He kept the note from Lucy too. Both of them went into a small wooden box in his office. He never showed them to anyone. But he looked at them often. Years later, after Johnny retired, after Lucy passed away, that box was found among his belongings. Inside were dozens of notes. Letters. Photos. Each one representing a moment when the show had stopped being a show and started being something more. Something human. Gary Morton lived another 18 months. Lucy stayed by his side every day. She stopped performing. She stopped pretending. She became the person Johnny had seen that night, raw, vulnerable, real. When Gary passed in 1987, Lucy didn't return to The Tonight Show immediately. She couldn't. The pain was too fresh. But 3 months later, she did something unexpected. She called Johnny. Not through NBC. Not through producers or agents. She called his private line. The one only a handful of people had. And when he answered, she said 5 words. "I need to thank you." Johnny tried to deflect. That was his nature. "Lucy, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "What you did that night, you didn't just let me speak. You gave me permission to be broken. And that saved me." There was a long silence on the line. Johnny didn't know what to say. For once, the man who always had the perfect response had no words. "You know what Gary told me before he died?" Lucy continued, her voice steady now. He said that Carson? He's the real deal. And he was right. Johnny's throat tightened. I'm glad I could be there for you, Lucy. You were more than there, she said. You were present. And that's rare in this business. 2 weeks later, Lucy returned to The Tonight Show. Not as a guest. As a co-host. For one night only. Johnny had offered her the chance to just sit and talk, but she wanted to do something more. She wanted to laugh again. That night, they didn't talk about Gary. They didn't talk about cancer or grief or loss. They talked about the old days. About I Love Lucy. About the time she accidentally set Desi's hairpiece on fire during a taping. About the chaos and joy and madness of building something from nothing. The audience laughed. Johnny laughed. And Lucy, for the first time in months, laughed too. At the end of the show, as the credits rolled, Lucy leaned over to Johnny and whispered something the cameras didn't catch. This is what healing looks like. Johnny nodded. He understood. When Lucy passed away in 1989, Johnny didn't do a tribute segment. He didn't tell stories or show clips. He simply walked out onto the stage, sat behind his desk, and held up a small piece of paper. The note. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't explain it. He just held it up, looked into the camera and said, "She trusted me with her pain. And I will carry that trust with me forever." Then he set it down, cleared his throat, and moved on with the show. But everyone who had been watching that night in 1985 understood. They remembered. And in that moment, they grieved with him. Johnny framed Lucy's thank you note after her death. It hung in his office until the day he retired. When he left NBC for the last time in 1992, he took only 3 things with him. A photo of his sons, his favorite coffee mug, and that frame. The note inside read, "Thank you, friend. You showed me it's okay to be human. Lucy." In the years that followed, that night became legend. Young late-night hosts would study the tape, trying to understand what Johnny had done. How he'd known to stand up. How he'd known to sit beside her instead of across from her. How he'd known when to speak and when to stay silent. David Letterman once asked him about it during a private dinner in 1991. "Johnny, that night with Lucy, how did you know what to do?" Carson stirred his coffee slowly. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I didn't know," he said. "I just knew what she needed wasn't an interviewer. It was a friend." Letterman nodded, absorbing the weight of those words. "The thing about live television," Johnny continued, "is that you can't rehearse the real moments. You can plan jokes, you can time your pauses, you can control almost everything. But when someone hands you their heart, there's no script for that. You just have to be there." He took a sip of his coffee and looked out the window. "Lucy taught me that night that the desk isn't what matters. The cameras don't matter. What matters is the person sitting across from you. And if they need you to stop being a host and start being human, you do it. Every single time." That philosophy became Johnny's unspoken rule for the rest of his career. It's why he cried with Bette Midler on his final show. Why he held Robin Williams' hand when Williams talked about his struggles. Why he gave unknown comedians extra time even when producers signaled to cut. He learned from Lucy that the greatest gift television could give wasn't laughter. It was permission. Permission to feel. Permission to be broken. Permission to be real. When Johnny Carson died in 2005, his sons found the wooden box in his study. Inside were dozens of notes and letters, but Lucy's was on top. Beneath it was the original folded note she'd handed him that November night in 1985. It had yellowed with age. The creases were worn thin from being unfolded and refolded so many times. But the words were still clear. "I can't pretend anymore. Help me." And on the back, in Johnny's handwriting, a single sentence he'd written years later. "She helped me more than I ever helped her." That's the thing about that night. Everyone thought Johnny was the hero. The man who stopped the show to help a friend. But Johnny knew the truth. Lucy was the brave one. She was the one who chose vulnerability over performance. Who chose truth over image. Johnny just recognized it. And honored it. And in doing so, created a moment that transcended television and became something eternal. A reminder that behind every performance, there's a person. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is see them. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. What happened that night in 1985 wasn't just television. It was a reminder that behind every smile, behind every performance, there's a person. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop pretending. Johnny Carson understood that. He understood that his desk wasn't a barrier. It was a bridge. A bridge between him and the people watching. A bridge between performance and truth. And on that November night, when Lucille Ball handed him a folded note, he didn't hesitate. He crossed that bridge. He sat beside her. He held her hand. And in doing so, he showed millions of people that it's okay to not be okay. That's the legacy Johnny Carson left behind. Not just the jokes. Not just the monologues. But the moments when he chose humanity over entertainment. When he chose connection over comfort. The note is gone now. Lost to time, like so many things. But the moment it created lives on. In the memories of those who watched. In the letters that still arrive at NBC, decades later, from people who remember that night. In the hearts of everyone who's ever needed permission to stop pretending and just feel. Sometimes a piece of folded paper can change everything. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is unfold it.